Welcome to the free sample of the Psychology of Totalitarianism by Mattias Desmet. What follows is the introduction and Chapter 3, The Artificial Society. The book is available wherever books are sold. Visit chelseagreen.com for more information. Click on the screen now to learn more.
Introduction. To write a book about totalitarianism, the idea first occurred to me on November 4, 2017. Or rather, it first appeared then in my scientific diary, a notebook I used to scribble down anything that might be useful for a later article or book. At the time, I was staying at a chalet in the Ardennes owned by a couple of friends. In the early morning hours, as the rising sun illuminated the surrounding woods, I opened my diary to write down thoughts that had spun during the night. Perhaps it was the peace and quiet of the natural environment that made me more sensitive than usual. But on that November morning, I was gripped by the palpable and acute awareness of a new totalitarianism that had left its seed and made the fabric of society stiffen. Even by 2017, it could no longer be denied. The grip of governments on private life was growing tremendously fast. We were experiencing an erosion of the right to privacy, especially since 9/11. Alternative voices were increasingly censored and suppressed, particularly in the context of the climate debate. The number of intrusive actions by security forces was rising dramatically, and more. It was not only governments behind these developments, however. The rapid emergence of woke culture and the growing climate movement was giving rise to the call for a new, hyper-strict government that emerged from within the population itself. Terrorists, climate changes, heterosexual men, and, later, viruses were considered too dangerous to be tackled with old-fashioned means. The technological tracking and tracing of populations became increasingly acceptable and was even deemed necessary. The dystopian vision of the German Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt loomed at society's horizon. The emergence of a new totalitarianism, no longer led by flamboyant mob leaders such as Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler, but by dull bureaucrats and technocrats. That November morning, I drafted the blueprint for a book in which I would explore the psychological roots of totalitarianism. At the time, I wondered, why did totalitarianism as a form of statehood emerge for the first time in the first half of the 20th century? And moreover, what is the difference between it and the classical dictatorships of the past? The essence of this difference, I realized, lies within the field of psychology. Dictatorships are based on a primitive psychological mechanism, namely on the creation of a climate of fear amongst the population, based on the brutal potential of the dictatorial regime. Totalitarianism, on the other hand, has its roots in the insidious psychological process of mass formation. Only a thorough analysis of this process enables us to understand the shocking behaviors of a totalitarianized population, including an exaggerated willingness of individuals to sacrifice their own personal interests out of solidarity with the collective, i.e., the masses, a profound intolerance of dissident voices, and pronounced susceptibility to pseudoscientific indoctrination and propaganda. Mass formation is, in essence, a kind of group hypnosis that destroys individuals' ethical self-awareness and robs them of their ability to think critically. This process is insidious in nature. Populations fall prey to it unsuspectingly. To put it in the words of Yuval Noah Harari, most people wouldn't even notice the shift toward a totalitarian regime. We associate totalitarianism mainly with labor, concentration, and extermination camps, but those are merely the final, bewildering stage of a long process. In the months and years after I made these initial notes, more and more references to totalitarianism appeared in my diary. They spun into longer and longer threads that organically connected with other areas of my academic interests. For example, The psychological problem of totalitarianism touched upon a crisis that had erupted in the scientific world in 2005, a theme that I explored extensively in my doctoral dissertation. Sloppiness, errors, biased conclusions, and even outright fraud had become so prevalent in scientific research that a staggeringly high percentage of research papers, up to 85% in some fields, reached radically wrong conclusions. And the most fascinating thing of all, from a psychological point of view, most researchers were utterly convinced they were all conducting their research more or less correctly. Somehow, they failed to realize that their research was not bringing them closer to the facts, but instead was creating a fictitious new reality. This, of course, is a serious problem, especially for contemporary societies that place their faith in science as the most reliable way of understanding the world. Furthermore, the foregoing problem is directly related to the phenomenon of totalitarianism. In fact, this is precisely what Arendt exposes. The undercurrent of totalitarianism consists of blind belief in a kind of statistical, numerical, scientific fiction that shows radical contempt for facts. The ideal subject for a totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and the distinction between true and false no longer exist. The poor quality of scientific research reveals a more fundamental problem. Our scientific worldview has substantial shortcomings, the consequences of which extend far beyond the field of academic research. These shortcomings are also the origin of a profound collective unease, which, in recent decades, has become increasingly palpable in our society. People's view of the future is now tainted with pessimism and lack of perspective, more so every day. Should civilization not be washed away by rising sea levels, then it certainly will be swept away by refugees. The grand narrative of society, the story of the Enlightenment, no longer leads to the optimism and positivism of yesteryear, to put it mildly. Much of the population is trapped in almost complete social isolation. We see a remarkable increase in absenteeism due to mental suffering, an unprecedented proliferation in the use of psychotropic drugs, a burnout epidemic that paralyzes entire companies and government institutions. In 2019, this predicament was clearly perceptible in my own professional environment. I saw so many colleagues around me drop out from work due to psychological problems, hindering the capacity to perform even basic day-to-day work. For example, that year it took me nearly 9 months to obtain a signature on a contract that was required for me to get started on a research project. The university departments that had to review the contract and grant their approval were dealing with so much absenteeism that there was always someone on sick leave due to mental suffering, so that the contract simply didn't get finalized. During that period, all social stress indicators rose exponentially. Anyone familiar with systems theory knows what this means. The system is heading for a tipping point. It is on the verge of reorganizing itself and seeking a new equilibrium. At the end of December 2019, in the same Ardennes chalet I mentioned earlier, I ventured to make a small prediction in the company of friends. One of these days, we will wake up in a different society. This intuitive premonition even enticed me to take action. A few days later, I went to the bank to pay off the mortgage on my house. Whether or not that was a wise thing to do depends entirely on your perspective. Maybe it wasn't wise from a purely economic or tax point of view, but that was of no concern to me. First and foremost, I wanted my sovereignty back. I did not want to feel indebted to and complicit in a financial system that, in my view, played a part in the social impasse that was about to occur. The bank manager listened to my story. He even agreed with me. But he insisted on knowing why I felt so determined about it. Even after we spoke for an hour and a half, It wasn't enough to fill the emptiness of his question. I ended up leaving him wondering, well past the closing time of his branch office, which was to be shut down forever shortly thereafter. A few months later, in February 2020, the global village began to shake on its foundations. The world was presented with a foreboding crisis, the consequences of which were incalculable. In a matter of weeks, everyone was gripped by the story of a virus, a story that was undoubtedly based on facts. But on which ones? We caught a first glimpse of the facts via footage from China. A virus forced the Chinese government to take the most draconian measures. Entire cities were quarantined, new hospitals were built hastily, and individuals in white suits disinfected public spaces. Here and there, rumors emerged that the totalitarian Chinese government was overreacting and that the new virus was no worse than the flu. Opposite opinions were also floating around, that it must be much worse than it looked, because otherwise no government would take such radical measures. At that point, everything still felt far removed from our shores, and we assumed that the story did not allow us to gauge the full extent of the facts. Until the moment that the virus arrived in Europe. We now began recording infections and deaths for ourselves. We saw images of overcrowded emergency rooms in Italy, convoys of army vehicles transporting corpses, morgues full of coffins. The renowned scientist at Imperial College confidently predicted that without the most drastic measures, the virus would claim tens of millions of lives. In Bergamo, sirens blared day and night, silencing any voice in public space that dared to doubt the facts. From then on, story and facts seemed to merge, and uncertainty gave way to certainty. The unimaginable became reality. We witnessed the abrupt pivot of nearly every country on Earth to follow China's example and place huge populations of people under de facto house arrest, a situation for which the term lockdown was devised. A surreal silence descended, ominous and liberating at the same time. The sky without airplanes, traffic arteries without rushing blood, the dust of chasing vain desires settling down. And in India, the air became so pure that for the first time in 30 years, in some places, the Himalayas became once more visible against the horizon. It didn't stop there. We also saw a remarkable transfer of power. Expert virologists were called upon as George Orwell's pigs, the smartest animals on the farm, to replace the unreliable politicians. They would run the animal farm with accurate, quote, scientific information in a time of plague. But these experts soon turned out to have quite a few common human flaws. In their statistics and graphs, they made mistakes that even ordinary people would not easily make. It went so far that, at one point, they counted all deaths as coronavirus deaths, including people who had died of, say, heart attacks. Nor did they live up to their promises. These experts pledged that the gates to freedom would reopen after 2 doses of the vaccine. But when the time came, things didn't change, and they came up with the need for a third. And just like Orwell's pigs, they sometimes changed the rules overnight, inconspicuously. First, the animals had to comply with the measures because the number of sick people could not exceed the capacity of the healthcare system, flatten the curve. But one day, everyone woke up to discover writing on the walls stating that the measures were being extended because the virus had to be eradicated, crush the curve. Eventually, the rules changed so often that only the pigs seemed to know them, and even that was not so sure. Some people became suspicious. How is it possible that these experts make mistakes that even laymen wouldn't make? Aren't they scientists? The kind of people who took us to the moon and gave us the internet. They can't be that stupid, can they? What is the end game? Their recommendations take us further down the road in the same direction. With each new step, we lose more of our freedoms until we reach a final destination where human beings are reduced to QR codes in a large technocratic medical experiment. That's how most people eventually became certain, very certain, yet of the most opposing things. Some people were convinced that we were dealing with a killer virus, others that it was nothing more than the seasonal flu, and still others believed that the virus did not even exist, and that we were dealing with a worldwide conspiracy. And there were also a few who continued to tolerate uncertainty and kept asking themselves, how can we adequately understand what is going on in our society? The coronavirus crisis did not come out of the blue. It fits into a series of increasingly desperate and self-destructive societal responses to objects of fear: terrorists, global warming, coronavirus. Whenever a new object of fear arises in society, there is only one response and one defense in our current way of thinking: increased control. The fact that the human being can tolerate only a certain amount of control is completely overlooked. Coercive control leads to fear, and fear leads to more coercive control. Just like that, society falls victim to a vicious circle that inevitably leads to totalitarianism, which means to extreme government control, eventually resulting in the radical destruction of both the psychological and physical integrity of human beings. We have to consider the current fear and psychological discomfort to be a problem in itself, a problem that cannot be reduced to a virus or any other object of threat. Our fear originates on a completely different level, that of the failure of the grand narrative of our society. This is the narrative of mechanistic science, in which man is reduced to a biological organism, a narrative that ignores the psychological, symbolic, and ethical dimensions of human beings, and thereby has a devastating effect at the level of human relationships. Something in this narrative causes man to become isolated from his fellow man and from nature. Something in it causes man to stop resonating with the world around him. Something in it turns the human being into an atomized subject. It is precisely this atomized subject that, according to Arendt, is the elementary building block of the totalitarian state. Totalitarianism is not an historical coincidence. In the final analysis, it is the logical consequence of mechanistic thinking and the delusional belief in the omnipotence of human rationality. As such, totalitarianism is the defining feature of the Enlightenment tradition. Several authors have postulated this, but it hasn't yet been subject to a psychological analysis. This book fills that gap. We will analyze the symptom of totalitarianism and situate it within the broader context of the social phenomena from which it forms a part. Part 1, chapters 1 to 5, covers how the mechanist materialist view of man and the world creates the specific social psychological conditions in which mass formation and totalitarianism thrive. Part 2, chapters 6 to 8, details the process of mass formation and its relationship to totalitarianism. Finally, Part 3, chapters 9 to 11, investigates a way to transcend the current condition of man and the world, so as to render totalitarianism superfluous. As a matter of fact, Part 1 and Part 3 of this book only marginally refer to totalitarianism. It is not my aim with this book to focus on that which is usually associated with totalitarianism: concentration camps, indoctrination, propaganda, but rather the broader cultural historical processes from which totalitarianism emerges. This approach allows us to focus on what matters most. Totalitarianism arises from evolutions and tendencies that take place in our day-to-day lives. Ultimately, this book explores the possibilities of finding a way out of the current cultural impasse in which we appear to be stuck. The escalating social crises of the early 21st century are the manifestation of an underlying psychological and ideological upheaval, a shift of the tectonic plates on which a worldview rests. We are experiencing the moment in which an old ideology rears up in power one last time before collapsing. Each attempt to remediate the current social problems, whatever they may be, on the basis of the old ideology will only make things worse. One cannot solve a problem using the same mindset that created it. The solution to our fear and uncertainty does not lie in the increase of technological control. The real task facing us as individuals and as a society is to construct a new view of man and the world, to find a new foundation for our identity, to formulate new principles for living together with others, and to reappraise a timely human capacity, speaking the truth. Chapter 3. The Artificial Society. What is the endgame of mechanistic ideology? To answer this question, we must return to the Cathedral of Pisa, where the eyes of 17-year-old Galileo Galilei follow a swinging lamp. With his youthful openness and curiosity, Galileo sees something that countless eyes had never noticed. Whether the pendulum makes a long or a short swing, the time it takes to swing hence and forth is always the same. Upon closer analysis, this makes sense. Long swings start from a higher position, and as the object begins its downward motion, it accelerates in its path. Shorter swings start from a lower position, and as the object begins its downward motion, it accelerates less. The speed at which the pendulum travels on its path is directly proportional to the length of the arc it makes, and therefore the movement of the pendulum always lasts the same amount of time. Galileo's discovery was brilliant, no doubt, but it wasn't quite right. Christian Huygens noticed something when he was building his pendulum clocks. If he attached several clocks to the same wall, their pendulums would eventually move in a perfect simultaneous manner. He couldn't help but conclude that somehow the clocks were in communication with one another. Huygens assumed, rightly as it turned out, that the vibrations of the pendulums spread through the wall, causing small deviations in duration that, in a way that is difficult to understand, eventually cause the pendulum movements synchronize. That is to say, pendulums are more complex than Galileo's simple law suggests. Apparently, they have the ability to adjust their movements under the influence of their environment. Precision measurements of the duration of motion confirm Huygens' view, at least to the following extent. Contrary to what Galileo thought, pendulums do not always swing for exactly the same amount of time. Sometimes it takes just a little longer, sometimes just a little less time to complete its movement. And this also turned out to be the case if a pendulum is swinging in an isolated state, without the process of synchronization. The swing's durations are not exactly the same. Initially, these deviations were dismissed as a form of insignificant noise. The irregularity in the pendulum was believed to be the result of coincidental mechanical factors, such as changes in surrounding airflow or the chain twisting. It took until the second half of the 20th century to discover that this was not correct. These apparently random deviations form a pattern that can be described with a mathematical formula, but is nevertheless strictly unpredictable. Pendulums have the characteristic of deterministic unpredictability, which we will revisit in Chapter 9. What's more, the aforementioned pattern is unique to each pendulum. Pendulums have been regarded as dull mechanical phenomena that dutifully followed Galileo's law. But those elementary mechanical devices were, in fact, creative in nature and idiosyncratically capable of disobedience. In Chaos, James Gleick puts it this way: Those studying chaotic dynamics discovered that the disorderly behavior of simple systems acted as a creative process. It generated complexity, richly organized patterns, sometimes stable and sometimes unstable, sometimes finite and sometimes infinite, but always with the fascination of living things. Reducing the pendulum's behavior to Galileo's law robs it of its social qualities, as well as its individuality and creativity. If you were to create a virtual pendulum in a computer program that behaves strictly according to Galileo's law, it would look very much like a real pendulum, but it would be a death phenomenon, lacking the lively chaos of a real pendulum. Galileo's pendulum illustrates a universal law. The logic and rational explanation of a natural phenomenon, however comprehensive it may be, always makes an abstraction of that phenomenon. Theoretical models never capture anything fully. They always leave an unexplained remainder. This remainder is not just insignificant random noise. It is the essence of the object. It is its living component. You can see this, for example, in the difference between natural and artificial products. Whether it's a genetically engineered plant, lab-printed meat, vaccine-induced immunity, or high-tech sex dolls, whenever we artificially reproduce a natural phenomenon from rational analysis, the artificial phenomenon is not identical to the original. The loss is not always immediately visible. Sometimes it is barely visible at all, and yet it is crucial, both on a physical and psychological level. The digitalization of human interactions, replacing real human interactions with digital ones, is a good example thereof. With the coronavirus crisis, the trend toward a digital society made a big leap forward. Teleworking became the norm. Student life took place online. Aperitif and coffee were consumed in front of a television or computer screen. Even sex was mediated through technological machinery, and the death penalty was carried out from a safe digital distance. Initially, it was mainly seen as a necessity and occasionally as an advantage. People felt protected from the virus, saved time, avoided traffic jams, reduced their ecological footprint, and spared themselves the stress and discomfort that can characterize human encounters. However, this acceleration of online existence also accelerated burnout and exhaustion, to the extent that some now speak of digital depression. Perhaps the heart of the problem lies in the following. A conversation not only conveys information, there is also a subtle but equally profound bodily exchange, and this is disrupted by digitalization. This physical aspect of speaking is of vital importance. It makes language a matter of love and lust, charged with a refined, eroticizing power. That's why we physically crave a real conversation after a week of working online. A digital conversation is not the same as a real conversation. We see this most clearly in infants. During the first 6 months, they learn to distinguish language sounds to an astonishing pace, but only while listening to someone who is physically present, not when listening to an audio or video recording. See Kuhl's experiments. Early language learning is inseparable from the physical presence of the other. The child internalizes the mother's body language as it satisfies its physical needs with the warmth of her body, the milk of her breasts. The child breathlessly fixates on the mother's face and imitates the expressions that play on it. It listens with the closest attention to the sound she makes, and even with its earliest sobbing and crying, already echoes the melody and tones of her speech. What's more, this synchronization already takes place before birth, in the womb. Annie Murphy Paul's experiments. What babies learn before they are born. shows that the infant's crying immediately after birth already bears melodic resemblance to its mother's voice. And if a newborn listens to its mother's voice through the headphones while nursing on the left breast, and someone else's voice while nursing on the right, it will begin nursing significantly more on the left. The conclusion is inescapable. The child has already become familiar with its mother's voice in the womb. Life in the womb has predestined it to resonate with that specific voice. After birth, the child further develops this primal resonance. This doesn't happen haphazardly. The child achieves a kind of symbiosis with the mother through its creative imitations of her sounds and facial expressions. In this way, it will feel what she feels. As it takes on its mother's happy expression, it also feels her joy. If it takes on her sad expression, it shares in her unhappiness. Something similar applies to the exchange of sounds. In the clinking and clanging of the mother's language trembles the well and woe of her being, and the child who imitates that language resonates with it on the same psychological wavelength. This early resonance between child and its social environment leads to a unique phenomenon. The young child's body gets loaded with a series of vibrations and tensions that become embedded in the deepest and finest fibers of its body. They form a kind of body memory that not only programs the function of the musculature, glands, nerves, and organs, but also predisposes the child to certain psychological conditions or disorders. The human body is, in the most literal sense, a stringed instrument. The muscles that span the skeleton, the body's other fibers, are put on a certain tension in early childhood through imitative language exchanges. This tension determines with which social phenomena one will resonate. It determines the frequencies to which one will be sensitive in later life. That's why certain people and certain events can literally strike a chord. They touch the body and, as such, touch the soul. It is for this reason that the voice can make the body ill, or, conversely, heal it. That is why the voice is of vital importance, especially at an early age. Lack of a voice is fatal to the young child. The Austrian-American psychiatrist René Spitz studied two groups of children whose biological needs, food, drink, clothing, housing, were satisfied in identical ways, except that one group had a stable psychological bond with a caretaker and the other did not. Spitz found that the mortality rate was significantly higher in the latter group. This subtle physical dimension of linguistic exchange remains important throughout life. While speaking, adults, like young children, constantly mirror the facial expressions and posture of the interlocutor without even realizing it. See research into so-called mirror neurons. This happens through a kind of inner imitation, through slight and imperceptible increases in muscle tension. No matter how subtle, this is more than enough to gauge, in an immeasurably short time span, the deeper layers of the other's subjective experiencing. Whether that person is in pain, feels sad or happy, is perhaps just pretending, and to mimic it. This leads to a remarkably direct connection between interlocutors. Professionally, I have been studying psychotherapeutic conversations in detail for 15 years and have been able to ascertain this in a concrete way. To highlight a single aspect, people react incredibly quickly to one another during conversations. When one person stops speaking, the other usually begins in less than 0.2 seconds. The response time to a traffic light is on average 5 times longer. And this happens even if the speaker doesn't finish his sentence, so that the other person cannot possibly predict when he will stop on the basis of the semantic structure of the sentence. When people talk to one another, they sense each other very sharply because they perceive the slightest changes in intonation, voice timbre, facial expression, body position, rate of speech, and so on. Like flocking starlings, they form one organism. They are connected with one another through a psychic membrane that transfers the slightest ripple in body and soul. In every exchange of words, no matter how trivial, people show themselves to be perfect dance partners. They are subtly united through the eternal music of language. We make love more often than we realize. This complex phenomenon degrades when digitized. Digital interactions always have a certain delay, exclude certain aspects of contact, such as scent and temperature, are selective, you see only someone's face, and create the constant unpleasant pre-apprehension that the connection may drop. As a result, digital interactions are not only experienced as reticent and stiff, they also give us the feeling that we cannot really physically sense each other. In the words of workplace leadership expert Gianpiero Petriani, in digital interactions, our minds are tricked into believing that we are together, but our bodies know that we are not. What's so exhausting about digital conversations is being constantly in the presence of the other person's absence. From here, we see a direct association between digitalization and depression. In classical psychoanalytic theory, depression is associated with the frustrating experience of helplessness induced by the passivity or absence of a loved one, usually a parent, in childhood. Subsequently, you pay the other with the same currency. You yourself become passive, i.e. depressed. Digital connection leads to a similar dynamic. You feel helpless with respect to another, whom you experience as absent and unreachable, and react with frustration and passivity, i.e., feeling exhausted. Digitalization dehumanizes a conversation. This usually happens in a hidden, insidious way, but sometimes it can also be felt very sharply. A recent example from my psychotherapeutic practice. A woman in her early 40s wakes up one night with her hands covered in blood and realizes she is miscarrying the baby she's been yearning for her entire life. She asks me, sobbing, for a conversation, a real conversation. In such a situation, anyone can sense that the digital wall will not be scalable for the words in which the drama seeks its expression. Unless there really isn't any other possibility, offering a digital conversation in such a situation seems, indeed, almost inhumane. Similar examples can be extracted from educational settings. The enthusiasm of the teacher, which is almost physically palpable in a classroom, does not tolerate the journey through a fiber optic cable. Work environments. The support of a project leader is diluted in an online meeting. Love life. Try to salvage a wavering love with all the linguistic torment that characterizes it through online communication. And actually, any situation to which a person must be fully accompanied by his humanity. If all this is true, then why are digital interactions so attractive? Why did we happily give up chit-chatting for text messages long before the coronavirus crisis? It is convenient to communicate in this way with people who are far away. This is certainly true. However, there is also another psychological factor at play. Uncertainty is the preeminent characteristic of human experience. No other animal is so haunted by doubt or plagued by existential questions, and this is especially true of our relationship to the other. How can I do good for the other? Does he like me? Does he find me attractive? Do I mean something to him? What does he want from me? In a digital conversation, in which the other is literally kept at a distance, but can still be reached, these eternal questions and all the associated uncertainty and fear become less acute. The sense of control is far greater. It's easier to selectively show some things and hide others. In short, people feel psychologically safer and more comfortable behind a digital wall, but pay a price for it with the loss of connectedness. This brings us to a theme that will recur repeatedly in this book. The mechanization of the world causes man to lose contact with his environment and become an atomized subject, the kind of subject in which Hannah Arendt recognized the essential component of the totalitarian state. Science adapts its theory to reality, whereas ideology adapts reality to theory. This includes mechanistic ideology, which attempts to adapt reality to its theoretical fiction. It aims to optimize nature and the world. We already mentioned genetically engineered plants and animals, lab-printed meat, and other artificial products. But it extends much further than that. Some argue that menstrual periods are a superfluous inconvenience and advocate for eliminating them with artificial hormones and turning the female cycle into a single, flat line. And after years of experimenting with growing cow and dog fetuses in an artificial womb, which is little more than a plastic bag, some people believe that it is also time to replace a mother's womb with a synthetic sac. The only thing missing to make such practices completely identical to the breeding programs in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World is for the mother's voice to be replaced by the monotonous repetition of conditioning messages. In such a case, the melodious echoes of the mother's voice will no longer be reflected in her newborn's cries. Instead, the baby will arrive in the world already socially adapted. Other advantages cannot be underestimated. The future parents will be able to continue their normal lives during the 9 months of pregnancy. It isn't yet entirely clear as to whether the presence of the child will be allowed to change the life at all after the synthetic womb opens and the child is born. The synthetic womb is not as far away as we may think. The only thing required to persuade a society that is gripped by the mechanistic ideology is a slew of experts daily presenting statistics and data in the media, informing us that artificial wombs protect fetuses a few percentage points better against viruses and pathogens than the not-so-sterile mother's body. Within this logic, anyone who chooses natural pregnancy will be considered unfit as a parent. Such people would expose their child to unnecessary risks, even before birth. Whether dissident voices could override such logic remains to be seen. Life itself can be defended only in terms of metaphor and poetry, yet these usually sound less loud than the monotonous droning of mechanistic arguments. These trends fit within the broader vision of an ideal society. Institutions that preoccupy themselves with the society of the future, such as the World Economic Forum, consider it a matter of course that the world will move toward a digicosm, a society in which human life is mainly conducted online. Strangely enough, the 21st century environmental movement is following this trend in lockstep. Insofar as it travels the eco-modernist route, it aims to save nature by protecting it from man. In those terms, living in the countryside is a crime. Just like lighting a wood stove and eating a piece of real, read, not lab-printed, meat. Within such logic, the ideal life is spent indoors on an intravenous drip. The fact that man and nature form a mystical unity and can exist in harmony is considered to be a romantic and unrealistic idea, even downright dangerous, considering the pressing issue of the climate change. This social vision tends to intersect with so-called transhumanism. This is a contemporary iteration of the mechanistic ideology that considers it desirable, even necessary, that future humans merge physically and mentally with machines. Transhumanists want to replace the chaos of writhing bodies with a strictly technological internet of bodies. To this end, bodies have to be saturated with microchips and be monitored via a powerful intranet. Once this is achieved, it will not only be possible to fight crime and sexual harassment more efficiently than ever before, but also to carry out genetic correction and preventative medicine through the collection of biometric data and replacing the body's natural resilience with vaccine-generated artificial immunity. Even the human mind would benefit from these developments. In 2020, Elon Musk announced that within 5 years, we will no longer need clumsy human language, that source of eternal misunderstandings, because he will provide a microchip that can be built into the brain and that will allow humans to communicate via flawless digital signals. What follows should come as no surprise. Within this utopia, they also want to control weather conditions, that source of angst for farmers worldwide since time immemorial, by means of radical mechanical technological means. Such measures are considered indispensable due to global warming, and the technologists believe they can do so. For example, they can obscure the sun by placing smart mirrors between the Earth and the sun, by launching sulfate clouds from rockets, or by detonating chalk bombs in the stratosphere. Mechanistic ideology always lives on credit. In the future, once perfect knowledge has been achieved and perfect technology has been mastered, it will translocate the man-machine into paradise. Yet for now, it mainly makes people sick and depressed. The triumphant music of the mechanistic ideology always contains a discordant note. If we know anything by now, it's that the achieved convenience always comes at a price, and that price usually becomes apparent only after it's too late. The fluorine compounds in Teflon pans and the PFAS in water-repellent raincoats turns out to be carcinogenic. So is the ethylene oxide used in hundreds of everyday products. The connection between chemicals and chronic, non-infectious degenerative diseases, the so-called diseases of civilization, is basically well known, but that doesn't stop or redirect the relentless drive to push civilizing further down the road. The greater the impact of mechanistic science on the world, the more it becomes clear that we're creating problems for which we can hardly find a solution. The ever-thickening plastic soup in the oceans and the nuclear waste that remains active for hundreds of thousands of years are just a few examples. Those problems were, in principle, clear from the start to those who had eyes to see it. In the 18th century, the British painter and poet William Blake, for example, already had a keen sense of the destructive and dehumanizing nature of the mechanization of the world. In a sense, his entire oeuvre testifies to it. Unfortunately, he was, and remains, an exception. Why is mankind so hopelessly seduced by mechanistic ideology? Partly because it's under the influence of the following illusion: that one is able to remove the discomforts of existence without having to question oneself at all. This is best illustrated by modern medicine. The cause of suffering is typically traced to a mechanical defect in the body or to an external entity, such as a pathogenic bacterium or virus. Its cause is localized and can, in principle, be controlled, managed, and manipulated without the patient having to wrestle with any psychological, ethical, or moral complexity. A pill helps you get rid of your problems. Plastic surgery frees you from your complexes without having to question the origin of your shame and embarrassment. While the practical applications of mechanistic science makes life easier, in a sense, the essence of life eludes us evermore. Much of that process takes place below conscious awareness, but the sharp increase in acute mental suffering is an unmistakable sign that is discernible at society's surface. The Enlightenment man could hardly help but cling to utopian optimism. In the 19th century, Industrialization heralded the disappearance of the aristocratic and class society and associated local social structures. Man tumbled out of his social and natural context, and as he fell, meaning dropped away too. In this disenchanted mechanistic world, Max Weber, life became meaningless and ateleological. The machinery of the universe runs without meaning or purpose, and religious frames of reference also lost coherence. Anxiety and unease, once tied to the oppression and abuse of the aristocracy and clergy, began to drift ineffably around the human soul. Frustration and aggression, once held in check by fear of hell and the Last Judgment, proved increasingly easy to mobilize. The prospect of an afterlife dwindled and was readily replaced by belief in an artificially created mechanistic scientific paradise. It is here that we, together with Hannah Arendt, situate the undercurrent of totalitarianism, a naive belief that a flawless humanoid being and a utopian society can be produced from scientific knowledge. The Nazi idea of creating a purebred Superman based on eugenics and social Darwinism, and the Stalinist ideal of a proletarian society based on historical materialism are prototypical examples, as is the current rise of transhumanism. When we hear about such ideologies, we like to believe that they are the products of deranged minds. This is a misconception. Plato, for example, found eugenics a commendable practice that had a place in his ideal state. And the 20th century taught us that this practice does indeed lead to certain successes. The systematic abortion of fetuses with genetic predispositions to thalassemia in Cyprus resulted in this hereditary blood disease almost completely disappearing from the island. We have to seriously ask ourselves the following question: why not follow the principles of eugenics? As a social strategy, it can be rejected on purely ethical grounds, but it is crucial that we also be capable of rejecting it on rational grounds. The essence on rational grounds might be this: eugenics may sometimes lead locally to desired results, insofar as it concerns combating undesirable characteristics. From an overall point of view, however, it has more disadvantages than advantages. Government regulation of the intimate sphere leads to psychological despair and, ultimately, to a decline in physical health. We will further elaborate on this theme in the final chapters. Even within the context of an ideology that would make physical health its ultimate goal, eugenics is a questionable strategy that ignores the complexity and subtlety of the human being. As Hannah Arendt states, totalitarianism is ultimately the logical extension of a generalized obsession with science, the belief in an artificially created paradise. Science has become an idol that will magically cure the evils of existence and transform the nature of man. In the next chapter, we will delve more deeply into one of the core features of both the mechanistic and totalitarian discourse, a naive belief in the measurability of reality and the excessive use and misuse of data and statistics.
The book is available wherever books are sold. Visit chelseagreen.com for more information. Click on the screen now to learn more.